We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
Grievances we could go into with this system. I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. Today, Sam Ehrlich is joining us remotely, so we'll just start there. Sam, what hotel are you coming from, and what are you doing there?
Yeah, I'm coming here from the River Hotel, which is not the Conference Hotel, but it is $200 cheaper just across the river. I'm in Chicago, Illinois. I'm here for the Sports Lawyers Association annual meeting. I'll be presenting during the academic session later this afternoon, and yeah, just enjoying some really, really great panels. We have general counsels out here. We have, club presidents, team owners out here. They always get really, really great people. And, for our purposes, there'll be plenty of NCAA staff, plenty of athletic directors, a lot of people to ask questions of, and I'm looking forward to that part of it as well. So, yeah, happy to be out here.
Beautiful. Well, Sam, that curtails well. You're talking about value in hotels. Today, we're talking value in contracts. So with that, the idea of a perfect contract, I want to start off with, in all these NIL agreements, it's easy to look at, it's the student athlete and it's the institution. But in addition to that, who are the stakeholders in these NIL agreements throughout college athletics?
So if we're talking about rev share agreements, which is kind of where the last couple episodes have led us to, is figuring out what does this look like for a school within the confines of what the rules are right now and where we are without collective bargaining, and the different things that have come into play. The main stakeholders are the athletes and the schools. We certainly have conferences involved to a certain degree, and we've seen that to varying success across the country. The NCAA is an interested party, though not a party to the agreements. They're certainly setting the benchmarks and the standards. We've seen a couple of rulings even just recently, the CSC from the same standpoint of the NCAA. And then where it starts to get a little bit tricky, and I think that's a big part of the discussion today, is the associated entities, right? And we've talked about that a lot, and the CSC has talked about that a lot, and we just now have a ruling in the Nebraska arbitration case about, our multimedia rights partners who are more or less under the control of the universities and the athletic departments on a school level, but not on a national level, are they associated entities? And then anybody else who may ultimately come forward as a third-party NIL provider to a student athlete and is contemplated in a contract with the athlete, though that third party is not a party to the rev share contract, they're certainly an interested party. I don't know that they rise to the level of stakeholder, which is really a big part of this conversation about how do schools manage this third-party NIL concept when many of them are quasi-guaranteeing that income without making these other entities a party to the agreement. So I think that kind of sets the table for who all should be involved, who all needs to be considered, and who all is a part of these thought processes as we think about what is the perfect contract.
Yeah, and I think the topic came up last episode because of something Sam said. We were talking about, a student athlete transferring to another school, the school sued him. And I brought up the fact that why can't that just be put on the institution that the person's transferring to? And Sam brought up a legal premise that would disallow, one school from being able to put that on the other school. But I kind of thought it'd be more interesting to dig further into that. And I still don't quite understand, Sam, why, if I'm school A and I'm recruiting, Jimmy to come to this school, I don't understand why I can't put in a contract that says, hey, at year 3, you'll have the ability to transfer. But if you do, whatever school you transfer to is going to have to, buy out your contract. I don't know, because there's buyouts and coaches contracts, and maybe we're just talking about apples and oranges here, but I left a little confused last week. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It is an apples to apples comparison because you can have buyouts. That's not necessarily a problem. The issue is, the way you're framing it is having the, the next school pay for it. And then that's an issue. The legal concept that I brought up is something called privity of contract, which essentially states that, parties who are not actually party to a contract, if they're not actually part of this contract officially or even unofficially to a certain extent, it's third-party beneficiaries. So that's not third parties who have responsibilities on the contract. They can't necessarily be held to certain agreements under the contract. They can't necessarily be bound to agreements under the contract. We've had similar conversations, for example, when talking about the house settlement itself, which is a giant contract that, and I've mentioned that it cannot bind third-party NIL providers, collectives, boosters, all that. It can, it can punish the schools. It can, provide for provisions to punish schools, punish the athletes for, going against the contract to engage with those parties, but it can't punish the parties themselves, so it can't necessarily bind them either. And it's the same kind of principle here. You can't necessarily have a contract term that says, well, your new school is going to be paying for this buyout. And coaching contracts, like, it is an apples to apples comparison, because with coaching contracts, yes, we have kind of the general idea that the new school is going to be paying this buyout, but that's more of a custom than a legal obligation. Technically speaking, the buyout is assigned to the coach himself. It's assigned to the coach who's moving on. So Lane Kiffin, for example, who's subject to a lot of news this week. When he left Ole Miss for LSU, yes, LSU paid the buyout, but the buyout was actually assigned to him. Like, he had the obligation to pay it. He just agreed with LSU that LSU would be paying the buyout. So kind of a separate arrangement, and one where, yes, you can contract with a new school. You can contract with a third party to cover your existing obligations, but the obligations originate with you, not with the third party. And especially when the third party is unnamed, especially when it's, whatever school you transfer to has this obligation, that makes it even more legally suspect.
How does that compare to the international soccer transfer market, Sam? I know this has been brought up before, but I think that's such a easy model to aspire towards in this sense, because you've got certain players that have buyout clauses where you reach out to a club and it's $50 million and immediately you can start negotiating with that player, or we're going to negotiate club to club and we're going to determine the value is $30 million, whatever it is. So why is that not something that could be applicable to college athletics in the future?
Well, there's one key difference, and that is you have an overseeing organization who's facilitating that. You have agreements between the clubs themselves that kind of facilitate these transfer agreements that allow for essentially contracts between the clubs where, the contracts between the clubs allow for kind of this buyout market. Though I'm not 100% sure that it is the best comparison, the best kind of aspiration for college sports to have in this situation, because for one, here in the United States, I mean, if you're looking at these contracts between the clubs, that's exactly how we got in the first place. And I'm going to use our favorite phrase again, antitrust issue, because antitrust law would prohibit that. And in fact, if you're wondering, well, why is it allowed in European soccer? Well, for one, it's a different field of law, but for two, it's not allowed in European soccer. The Diallo decision in 2024 actually ruled that the transfer restrictions are unlawful under European competition law, which is their analogy to antitrust law. It's still going through a bunch of different procedural things, so it's not something where it's like, they had to stop doing it immediately, but it is something where a very high court in the European Union has ruled that the European soccer transfer market transfer fee is actually unlawful as well.
Why? What's the argument there? Why is it unlawful? If I am looking for this employee, I'm willing to pay X number of dollars to the former employer. Why is that an antitrust issue?
Well, it's a restraint on the labor market because it adds an extra cost beyond simply paying the new player their new contract in order to get this player. It involves paying a rival, someone who wouldn't necessarily want to be able to pay this amount of money to actually get this player, and it adds an additional burden, and it adds an additional kind of lever in order to access this labor market if you're the player. It's really similar, and we talked about this last week, a case called Mackey v. NFL back in the 70s, where the NFL had created the Rozelle rule, which required the required teams, if they're going to be signing a free agent from another NFL team, required teams to pay a draft, pay either a player or a amount of money to the player's whole team, and free agency tax. All of a sudden, players were getting paid a whole lot less because clubs were saying, well, if I have to pay, if I have to give a player to, this rival team, if I have to pay this rival team and allow them to do this, I'm going to be less inclined to sign you, or I'm going to be less inclined to pay to sign you because, I have this extra expense that I'm now incurring for this. And, as a result, the court in that case said that, yes, it is an antitrust violation because it is restricting this labor market. And the only reason we have restricted free agency, which is essentially the same thing in the NFL now, is because it's collectively bargained.
Fascinating. So I could get on my soapbox and say why my opinion is that the soccer model works and would work for college athletics, but that's not why we're here. We're here to talk the ideal contract in college athletics, rev share. So let's take it back a layer. And in general, Mike, you mentioned it earlier, but there are people involved in these discussions that are offering advice. Very few institutions, very few individuals have a Sam Ehrlich that are giving them the legal perspective on these things. So Mike or Joe, you've been around all these discussions. Who are the people that are advising both the institutions and the student athletes across the country?
I actually think one of the more complicated components of this is that a lot of the counsel is coming from an FAQ document that the NCAA published following the House settlement. And I think that document, given the fact of where it came from, even if you had somebody like Sam on your campus, if you were fortunate enough to have that person in your chamber, I think I'm putting words in Sam's mouth, but I think Sam might advise against some of the commentary that is in the FAQ. I think that there are some things that he would question and say, I don't know if that's actually enforceable, defensible, and justified. And that's kind of what I want to be able to get into in this conversation for sure is you've got this idea of what the NCAA has purported to be the contract that you should be putting together. There are things in those agreements, such as broadcast rights cannot be included in your agreement. The athletes NIL, and there's a whole legal discourse around broadcast NIL and what that looks like and different judgments in the last 20, 30 years and reasons for why that would be in there. But I think that kind of raises an immediate question for some of the schools who are going, I thought that was part of the calculation. Like, what is that supposed to be? I think there's other things in there about, whether or not money counts against the cap, if it's guaranteed outside, if you're going to say if you're going to have $100,000 that you're paying toward an athlete and you are guaranteeing that they're going to make $100,000 and you have the right to offset some of that through third party NIL. If you have guaranteed the money, it still counts against your cap, even if the money isn't coming out of your athletic department funds. And so there's a lot of ways to try to say, well, you could write it this way, but that may be called into question. But is it defensible for it to be called into question? Is it that enforceable when you go to the court? And we just saw what happened with Nebraska and the CSC, where you have essentially an agreement that says you are also going to get paid on top of your rev share agreement all this money from a third party, from Playfly. And it's kind of for warehouse rights. And there's not really a bunch of considerations really ironed out in the contract about what the athlete is going to do in exchange for that money. We'll just figure it out later. And the CSC in arbitration the judgment went in the CSC's defense or in their favor, where it says, okay, we agree with your extra scrutiny on this deal, and you are within your rights of the settlement allowed to scrutinize this to the point where you can deny it based on these factors. It's going to be reapplied. They're going to put in, another agreement that's going to get pushed through. We'll see. But that arbitration agreement itself is not necessarily indicative of how a court will rule on that if an ultimate lawsuit is brought forward. And so there's a handful of things in there. And I'm curious, Sam, if there's others that I've missed where you look at and say, this is what the NCAA is telling these schools as guidance, but you would question yourself as a legal expert in the space.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the Nebraska example is a perfect example, a very time-relevant example of exactly what we're talking about here, and exactly, and I would totally agree, with the words you put in my mouth that, yeah, I would probably be advising these schools in a way that, really does question kind of the FAQs and the guidance that's given from the NCAA. Because, to your example, and again, to this very perfect example, the NCAA and the CSC would tell you absolutely that warehousing deals with MMR companies are, violate or go against the House settlement, that will be struck down, that, they will not be approved. But and the Nebraska arbitration certainly helps that, certainly bolsters that position for the CSC. But we also have, a date coming up on June 10th where we're going to have really a lot of the same arguments, but in front of the magistrate judge who's been assigned by Judge Wilkin to oversee kind of questions and disputes regarding the House settlement. And he may see it differently. And his vote here is going to carry significantly more weight than this arbitrator. So the arbitrator's decision is non-precedential. It's not something that is, necessarily, it gives a picture of kind of how, at least some arbitrators are going to rule in this instance, but it's not necessarily something that has to be relied on moving forward, and certainly not something that Judge Cousins has to rely on moving forward. And Class Counsel is going to be bringing this case in front of Judge Cousins, saying that MMR companies are not associated entities, and therefore their deals are not subject to CSC review at all. So while the NCAA and CSC will tell you something absolutely that these deals are not going to be allowed, they may not even be reviewable in the first place. So again, it's something where a lot of still outstanding questions, and those questions really kind of again go against these FAQs that Mike was talking about, and kind of along the same lines. Like maybe that just shows where my brain is thinking maybe this is why schools aren't going to want to hire me for this kind of thing, but. You look at the contracts, bringing the discussion back to contracts, and the first thing I would advise schools to do is to remove the language saying that these deals are not paid for play. That goes against the NCAA, that goes against the CSC, that goes against everything that, it's going to get the school in a lot of trouble, but it's going to make the contract significantly more enforceable because, we've had these discussions about these liquidated damages clauses, these buyouts, and there were remaining questions about whether they're actually even enforceable if the contract is so tied to NIL and broadcast NIL, which, the NCAA and these contracts even a lot of the times, disclaim the idea that it's even a thing in the first place. And you look back to the Marshall decision by the Sixth Circuit back in, I think it was 2008, that said that no, broadcast NIL is not a thing. The House motion to dismiss decision kind of went against that, but still, we don't really necessarily have a question whether these broadcast NIL deals are even kind of enforceable. I mean, they're revenue sharing deals or deals that are provided for under the House settlement, but without that pay for play element, if you're trying to enforce it in court, if you're trying to get an injunction that says, we're going to stop this player from playing for the new team because we have their exclusive rights. Well, you don't have their exclusive rights. You have the exclusive rights over the NIL. You do not have their exclusive rights over their play, over their performance.
You look like you're about to say something, Mike. I didn't want to interrupt you.
I just want to continue, the conversation forward as far as like what should be in a contract. And I think that's one of the biggest questions about in these contracts. I think one of the things I get hung up on, even when talking to schools about how, they could consider it and what this could look like. So often, at least the schools at the highest level are saying, well, we don't even really want to get anything back from the contract. We just need a contract because that's what's going to allow us to pay the athlete. And I think that's where we run into a lot of problems is that I think on their surface, a contract should be an exchange of value. And there's not a whole lot of top level colleges. And I think we can get into a really good conversation about the middle tier and what those universities should be looking to accomplish with their contracts. I think that's where our sweet spot can be. But I think at the highest level, it's worth noting that a lot of times these schools are really not even looking for anything. They're looking to limit the amount of deliverables and limit the amount of restrictions that they're putting on their athletes in order to just pay them the most money possible. And that, I think, challenges this whole concept of like, how do you write the best contract? If you're trying to write the best contract to decrease the obligations of the person that you're writing a contract for, I don't know that you're really trying to write the best contract. So I don't know that anybody's really trying to take Sam's advice and make sure that it doesn't say pay for play or, consider anything that I'm saying about like, well, make sure you get what you want in return. They don't really want anything in return right now. What they want in return is the ability to field the best possible team with the best possible players and not really have to worry about the cap, which is a whole different conversation about whether or not the cap's enforceable. But there's ways that they are going about these contracts to determine how can I make sure that I am opening myself up and opening the athletes up to the most economic advantage possible and not limiting their ability to go make money on the outside, not limiting our ability to help them make money on the outside that is all additive to the amount of money that the school is paying them through revenue share. So I think that makes it really difficult to answer, like, what is the perfect contract for one of the schools that is at the upper echelon, because they're not really concerned. All they want to do is make sure that it's something that somebody is willing to sign and that will get upheld in some sort of court review. But also they kind of want some of these to go through the courts and push the boundaries of what the House settlement has bound them to, I guess. And we're seeing that with the CSC. I mean, that was brought because of a school. Like the Nebraska thing was brought because the school's going, we want to be able to do this. And there's a bunch of schools lining up behind them right now wanting to be able to do the same thing. And so, Sam mentioned the June 10th date with regard to that class council, decision and where things are going to go about the MMR partners and whether they're associated entities. And I think that's going to be a big domino in where some of these things go. But, Joe, I think you really wanted to have this conversation around what does the perfect contract look like. I think we need to kind of parse a little bit who we're talking to and which schools might be considering these contracts, because I think they're very different right now, given whether the school is clearly providing benefits above and beyond what is written as the cap versus the schools that are trying to compete up to the level of the cap.
I think there's probably more schools struggling to even get to the cap at this point than those that are so far beyond it. So if we're talking about what the sweet spot is for this conversation, I'm probably looking at schools at that middle to upper middle tier. I mean, look, even if a school's at or above the cap, like it's not just snap our fingers and we're there. Like they're having to work to get there. So I'd probably focus my attention there. And you brought something up that we talk about all the time. Like these contracts are being written like just straight. Like they don't call it pay for play, but it's like we're only signing you to a contract to play your sport. And to your point, they're taking as many things off their plates as they can. Like they don't want to add things, but there's an ability to recoup some of your investment, through different things, signing different contracts with different businesses. And you doing this is going to be a part of your contract. That's what we expect from you. And that revenue that you're generating back, it might pay for the roster for another one of your programs on campus. But I don't know that enough people are looking at it that way. And I mean, we've had this conversation a lot. But to go back to your question, I'd probably say we're looking at that middle to upper middle tier to focus on. And so we're talking about, protecting an investment on the school's behalf. Like I don't think even a student athlete looking to sign with the school would have any issues with buyouts and different, escalations, because there's an investment there. And I think that's understanding. Sam, you talked about, it's just become, part of the process that the next school is going to pay that buyout. Like I fully believe we're going to get to that point on the student athlete side of things as well. And those are going to be in every contract. So we're talking about buyouts. We're talking about duration. We're talking about the health and safety of the student athletes, making sure that they've got protections, long after their playing career is over, similar to, what the NFL players have. We're talking about escalation in year to year. There's a lot. I mean, we could talk about this for days, but
before we get into modeling the contract, I have one other thing I wanted to ask Sam about the FAQ document. And it goes back to your point about, burdening the other university, the new university. There is a point in the contract that talks about if a school pays a buyout, if there is liquidated damages clause in an athlete's multi-year agreement and their new school covers that buyout, that counts against their cap for that upcoming year, and it reduces their cap. How does that differ from the conversation we just had in terms of defensibility, enforceability, and the legal stature?
Well, it differs because that's part of the House settlement, and the schools are party to the House settlement through the conferences, through, even if they're not part of the Power Four conferences, or I guess Power Five conferences, who are defendants to the settlement. They're party to the House settlement by opting into the House settlement, so they're agreeing to the terms of the House settlement, which does include, that clause in there that says if you're paying a buyout, at least to my understanding, I mean. It might have been something that was added later, which would, raise additional questions. But at least to my memory, I believe that was actually part of the House settlement where a buyout would be included towards the cap. And yeah, by agreeing to the House settlement, you're agreeing to the terms, and there's the privity of contract that we talked about. Whether it's something that can actually be practically enforceable, I'm not so sure. But that is certainly how the CSC, I'm sure, would defend it. And to your point, Joe, about having, kind of leading to the eventuality of having kind of this customary thing, just like we have with coach buyouts, to have the new schools pay the player buyouts. I think that's totally reasonable to assume, and I think that's something where we could probably expect it moving forward, but we still need to have kind of the question answered about whether these buyouts are even enforceable yet, because we just don't have that question answered right now. I mean, we have the Sorsby litigation going through the courts right now, which may be the first test, and especially given the unique circumstances surrounding that situation with, Sorsby potentially not even playing this year. I'm sure Texas Tech is probably not chomping at the bit to pay that buyout on behalf of Sorsby, given that Sorsby is probably not going to be paying. And I imagine within some Texas Tech circles, they're probably grumbling a little bit because apparently the gambling problem that he has was a thing not only at Cincinnati but at Indiana as well. So it was something where it's like, why would you pay for a buyout for a player who you knew was, kind of going to be an issue for us? But that's a whole other thing. And for the escalation part of it, I think that's also true as well, where contracts are extremely flexible. Yes, there's questions about enforceability. Yes, I've been shutting down the idea that certain, contract conditions could be enforceable moving forward. But when you have enforceability in these contracts, when you have an enforceable buyout, for example, you can structure it in a lot of different ways. You can do it where, if you have a player who, at a group of five school who, transfers to a group of five school versus a power four school, or even going power two versus, ACC and Big 12 versus group of five versus anything else, you could have different buyouts for that. Just, kind of depending on just how you structure the contract. Because again, these buyouts are so, clearly tied to the value lost. You could say that, well, clearly, based on our, reasonable explanations, if it's someone that's, going to be picked up by a power two school, that's clearly means his value is more, or his value is higher than it would be if he was just kind of transferring between a group of five schools. But again, that goes to pay for play. That shows that the value is in fact pay for play. It's not about, the NIL value, which is tied to so many different factors beyond performance on the field. And especially if you're specifically disclaiming pay for play in the contract, it gets really, really difficult to make that justification if it were something that were to go to court.
In that pay for play space, you look at, let's say we turn it into what it is that pay for play, and we're acknowledging that incentive pay, whether it's your conference player of the year, your all conference, all academic, whatever those markers are. How do incentive clauses in a contract work in this NIL space today? And maybe how should they work, Sam?
Yeah, and I think there really isn't a question about enforceability, because it's something where, who's going to be complaining if you do it? I'm sure the school will be very happy to pay for that. It may be a question, for the NCAA or the CSC, whether they feel like, that sort of thing violates the rules to have incentive pay. But, under, legal, contractual conditions, that kind of thing, it's perfectly acceptable and perfectly legal to do something like that, to condition additional compensation, additional consideration based on, particular things. And you can even sell it in the NIL space, where it's like, hey, if you're conference player of the year, if you're an All-American, if you're, doing all these different things, if if we go to a bowl game, based on your value as, in terms of your name and likeness is probably higher than it was before. So we are happy to give you additional compensation for that.
I think one of the things about that, and it goes back to the point I was making about where schools are in this different hierarchy of what they want to accomplish with their rev share money, is that there is a consideration, even in that FAQ document, it's all about academics, but there's a consideration for incentives where if you have a certain GPA, if you hit honors roll, if you hit whatever, that you can make a commitment to an athlete for that. One of the challenges of it is that it counts against your cap until you have determined whether or not to pay it out, right? So if it is an obligation to the university and a liability based on the contract, then it counts against the cap. And so all you're really doing, if this is a situation where you want to try to, incentivize performance and ensure that, excuse me, that you protect your downside as an institution, then it makes a ton of sense. If your main goal as an institution is to ensure that you are paying every dollar of the rev share cap, then the incentives don't actually help you, because you're running the risk where you've allocated the money, you've created the liability at the front end, and then you end up not being able to actually pay out the money. I'm sorry.
You need to get Mike some water.
And so it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, what you're trying to achieve. And if the point is to maximize the amount of money that you are able to give to an athlete with no regard for anything else, then incentives are not really going to be used at that level. I think that they can certainly be used at the level that Joe just referred to, at what we're talking about, as long as not everybody is trying to keep up with the Joneses and everybody's trying to set their own market at where they can live, then incentives make a ton of sense. And I think it's opened the door to the future potential of athletically related incentives that they kind of know this is what it looks like. They've built the structure for it. They've acknowledged that academically related incentives are okay. The athletic stuff is going to be challenged. We're going to find out really quick, I'm sure, whether or not that's something that is going to be allowed by CSC or by outside forces. And I think that we'll start to see it. But we've talked about this ad nauseum in different circumstances. Somebody has to do it first. A school has to do it first in order for everybody else to follow. And at some point, there's got to be that sort of chasm between the ultimately haves and have-nots, where the schools that are like, I would be okay not paying $20.5 million this year if I didn't have to. I'd be okay with that. The first school that's going to raise their hand, do that, say it out loud, incentives are going to be a big part of their contracts because they're going to be willing to pay it if the things are earned. But they're going to be okay with saying like, well, we actually didn't fulfill all of our obligations this year, so we didn't have to pay out $20.5 million, and we're okay with that. And we're okay even if another school is like using it as a recruiting disadvantage and telling the athletes, oh, this school only is going to pay you if you achieve certain things. We're going to pay you regardless. So that's the double-edged sword of it. And I think until we've got a handful of schools who are willing to say this is our reality and these are the contracts we want to write and we want to live by, if they're just trying to keep up with the Joneses, then the incentive stuff doesn't really help because of the way that it's structured within the cap.
So let's talk about the two sides of these agreements. And Joe, I turn to you. If you're the institution here, what's important to you in a contract language with any of these agreements and why?
I think the biggest thing for me as an institution is just protecting my investment. I mean, I've talked about this several times in the show. Like people, they get so hyper-focused on the numbers that they forget that there's a process of development. There's a cost to recruiting. There are so many financial obligations that the school is incurring that I think it's completely appropriate for the school to protect that investment at some level. Now, I also side with student athletes and want them to have the ability to be able to change their situation if they feel it's going to benefit them. I mean, these are small windows of time for somebody to make money off something they spent their entire life, preparing for. Most of these kids are not going to go play professional sports. This window in college is the time that they have to make money. So there's a balance for student athletes to make sure they're getting as much as they possibly can, but that a school is able to protect its investment. Like I fully believe that there is something there. That's why I kept bringing up, the buyouts, Sam. Like, yes, you as a student athlete have the right to transfer. But if you are going to do that within whatever specified contract that we have signed, like we are paying you, you are now subject to this contract. I believe the school should be able to get something back. I don't know that it needs to be something exorbitant, like $1 million. But if you've paid somebody $25,000, for the last 2 years, plus you've covered, the cost of going to school, books, I mean, everything, like housing, you're giving gear. Like, I don't think it's crazy to say, if you transfer, we want some of this back. And I don't think it's crazy.
And there's another reality that, for so long, schools, and we'll just talk football for the time being, schools have known that they probably need to bring in 20 to 25 new athletes on an annual basis. And there is a certain cost that it would take to go see and talk to and recruit enough athletes, bring them to campus to fill those spots. And all of a sudden you're living in a reality where you might have to fill 50 spots. And it's going to be twice as expensive, if not more, because now there's more competition. There's more people talking to all the, the different athletes, and there's more choices on the board when you've got all the transfers. And so it is simply an operating expense equation that it is more expensive to create a roster year over year than it used to be because of how many spots are potentially available, which is why, certainly roster retention is important from a lot of different angles. It's important from, fan apathy or lack thereof. If you can keep your roster together for a while, it's important for the development component. It's important for continuity. It's important to keep your roster together because it's going to cost you a lot more to replace the people that are on your roster. And so if there's a way to, through contracting, identify a way to at least recoup some of the costs that it's going to ultimately incur to be able to backfill those spots, I think it makes a ton of sense.
So we'll turn it over to Sam. Sam, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, for the record, I am not saying that buyouts are wouldn't be a good idea or wouldn't be helpful. I mean, clearly, across all the professional sports, like you have something resembling a buyout. It's just a question of whether it's enforceable or not. And given the way the contracts are currently structured with, being so tied to a player's very nebulous kind of NIL, that it's really just a question of whether it's something that can actually be enforced or not. And I am all for the days where we acknowledge the reality that these contracts are in fact pay for play, and that makes the buyout significantly more enforceable and, gives you the ability to structure them more creatively, like I talked about, and have higher values to them. It's just right now, if you're trying to say that, the players that the buyout is $1 million, you have to justify that the player's NIL is worth $1 million. And that's really, really difficult to do.
Well, Sam, no one loves antitrust and a free labor market more than you. So let's put you in the shoes of an agent discussing a contract on a student athlete's behalf. What are the elements that you deem to be most important from a student athlete perspective when these contracts are signed?
I think security is the main thing that these athletes are going to be looking for, and the main thing that agents are going to be looking for on the athlete's behalf. Like in the early days of the house settlement, and I know we're talking about something where it's like, the early days, it's something that was less than a year ago when it was actually approved. But it feels like so much longer than that. But in the early days of the house settlement, like you saw rumors, you saw reporting, you saw, all these various things on the very one-sided nature of a lot of these revenue sharing contracts where, I remember CBS Sports reporting that Florida State, my beloved alma mater, had in their contracts where even if a player got injured, they would lose, not only the remaining NIL value, that they have, but they'd also, be subject to potential clawback clauses as well. And that's something that as an agent, I would be fighting, tooth and nail to be able to get rid of. And in fact, even recommending that the player find a different institution to transfer to if that is. And that was a big reason, I think, why and this was predating the house settlement, but the Tennessee lawsuit was so important because, being able to negotiate these contracts, being able to see these contract terms before enrollment, before you're, locked into a particular school, at least for a year, that is incredibly important because you need to know what you're going to be signing up for. And also it's a leverage component as well, where, once you're locked into a school, it's really hard to negotiate and say, well, no, I don't want to do that because you're locked into that school. So that's the main thing I'd be looking for as an agent to a player. I'd also be very, very interested in kind of what types of buyouts are being negotiated here, because I'd want to be able to give my player the freedom to be able to leave if necessary. And, the way that some of these buyouts have been structured, like enforceable or not, that's often not even necessarily the question. We've seen so few of these lawsuits because we've seen so few of these things, but we don't know, what exactly is going on behind the scenes. And I think there's a lot of situations where the contracts are written in a way where it's not necessarily worth going to court, or the player just in general is just saying, well, I don't necessarily want to go to court over this. I'm just going to kind of sit and take it. We saw that with Damon Williams to a certain extent, where he got threatened with a lawsuit and said, okay, I'm going to come back to Washington. And, I think that's it's a very reasonable decision. It's a very fair decision, but it's one where I imagine a lot of these outfits are scared of being sued, and especially if the buyout is something that is incredibly challenging, incredibly difficult. You look at a big number on the page and you say, well, I'm really, really worried about having to pay that, even if my agent or my lawyer is telling me it's probably not enforceable. We don't know. We don't know any of that. So I think, kind of trying to negotiate down a lot of that is important as well, or at least structure it in a creative way where, if needed, there's a way to get out of the contract. If the coach leaves, if there's really other kinds of good cause to do it, that kind of thing as well.
All right. Before we get to our unilateral decision, is there anything we're missing on this subject matter that you guys want to get off your chest?
I did want to point out the irony of something that Mike said earlier, where right now only, or the FAQs at least, are really only contemplating academic incentives. And as a professor, obviously, these athletes doing well in school is great and should definitely be encouraged. But, from the perspective of raising their NIL value and these contracts being about NIL, I'm not so sure making the honor roll raises their NIL. So, maybe in some instances, but I do think there's some irony there.
I could go. There's so many pieces to the contract. I don't think schools are taking advantage of the contracts enough with the ability to monetize and recoup some of what they have the ability to do while a student athlete is on campus. Like, it's being looked at more as this is the base, and everything else we're going to go over the top. And I get it, but no other business operates like this. Like, if you sat down and said, we're gonna start this from scratch, and like this is how it's gonna work, like it's just no other business operates like this, and I don't understand it. You're looking at me waiting for me to keep going.
I do want you to keep going, but I also think that the unilateral decision will give you a chance to keep going. So I don't want to. I don't want to jump the gun here.
I would encourage a good Joe Nickel rant any day. So if we need to get into that, I support it fully. But the unilateral decision today, let's put ourselves in the case of your star athlete on campus. Whatever institution, this is the one person you're willing to spend the most for. What is a win-win as far as the contract's concerned for the university, the student athletes, the fans, everyone involved? What are the components that go into a perfect agreement for your star player and institution?
So I think that I even want to start with, like, how are you determining that? How are you determining that this is the star player, the best person that you have to absolutely have? Are you considering what that person brings to you, using like the baseball sabermetrics terminology? What's their WAR? What is their above replacement value to your institution? And I think once you start there, once you actually think about that and you take the emotion out of it to the best you possibly can, emotion is going to be a part of it because you've got fans that are tied to that person. You've got internal considerations that are tied to that person. And so that's a factor in their value. But if you can eliminate some of the emotion and just say, realistically, what would it cost us, both in terms of the ability to go out and replace them from a monetary standpoint, also the potential for us to not, achieve to the level that we think we'll be able to achieve so long as this person is here. What is the cost to us, both real monetary and opportunity from an achievement standpoint? And once you can actually answer that question for yourself, I think you have a lot more clarity around what you're willing to give up and what you're willing to negotiate with. there's going to be some hard and fast rules at every different institution, from every different coaching staff, from every different athletic director, university president, about things you're just not going to negotiate on. And that's okay. I think that's how it should be. I think every school should kind of come up with some of those things are for them. Are they always going to have a buyout in a contract, or are they not? Like, is that a non-negotiable? Is that a non-starter for somebody to come back and say, I don't want to have any liquidated damages? Or are you going to say, okay, well then we don't really want you? And I think whether that's the right example or not, who knows? Everything's negotiable, but I think you have to have some hard and fast rules that you're going in with, depending on what level you're at. And then I think you have to figure out, what is our stance on, are we going to what are we going to ask of the athlete beyond what they're doing, right? Sam's talked about it a lot. We can't escape the reality that these are essentially pay for play contracts cloaked in some other clothing. So what are we actually going to ask of this person? And then I think this is where it gets into Joe's point, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but I think that the schools have the ability to recoup a lot. What I would like to go into an agreement with this athlete is, here's what we can pay you, and here's all the things that we would be willing to pay you more for if you gave back to us. And we're willing to position that as, we're taking the responsibility off your plate. We are taking the responsibility away from you to have to then go out and seek other deals, but we're going to do it for you. We're going to sub-license your rights. We're going to monetize your rights. In exchange for us doing that, we're being very forthright with you that we're going to pay you for this. We're going to pay you this amount for the fact that you never have to go individually make an agreement again about putting your name and number on the back of a jersey. We're just going to do it. We're going to monetize it. We're going to keep the income that comes from that, but we've already paid you for it. Like, we've put this in the contract. Here's the line item. That's what it's worth. You're never going to have to negotiate another trading card deal in your life, because we're going to go do it now. We can keep autographs to the side, whatever. We can have these conversations. That's all part of what's in a contract. We're going to front you the money for your video game compensation. And we're going to front you so much money that it might even cover the fact that if you were on the cover, because we're going to go work our butts off to see that we can get you on the cover. We've already paid you for it. And if we don't get you on the cover, we tried. We paid you for it. There's so many things that we can do. There's so many things that the institution can say, we're going to pay you for this. I think with the best player on your campus, if you've identified what they bring to you and what it would cost you to lose them, you can start there and you can say, we're going to pay you this. We're going to pay you this, and you can have $1 million, $2 million, whatever that number is, and you can still go out, do all these other things on the outside. But what we're willing to do for you is, we're willing to take away all these other obligations, and we're going to pay you for them. We're going to pay you 2.5 if you give us these rights. We're going to pay you 3 if you give us these rights. And not only does that position us to be able to pay you more, it takes your responsibility away from having to go track down the money. We're just going to front you the money. We're going to give you the money in exchange for the rights. And we're going to be able to do that because we're going to go monetize those rights. We're not in this dance where it's like, we're going to pay you as much as we can, and we're going to support you making more money on the outside. We're being very realistic about, this is what we can give you, and we can give you more every time you give us more. And by you giving us more, it actually reduces the burden on you throughout the course of the season. And I think that you can be more successful as a football player and potentially, to the next level and things like that. I think there's a way to position it. And it's not even spin. It's real. It's very real that you can take those responsibilities away from somebody else to say, let us pay you for them. And I think that puts the school in a much better position to then understand what they're working with, understand the rights that they do have. Because I think a lot of times what we're running into right now is the schools running a bidding war, sometimes against themselves, to go just pay the most. And then they still don't even know what they can do with the rights, because they've given the athlete the ability to go monetize all of it themselves. And so you've got a marketing department sitting there going, I guess we can put him on a schedule poster, I think, right? Are we allowed to do that? Can he wear the jersey in our photo shoot? Are we allowing him to do that? And it's like, I don't know, we just paid him $5 million. Of course we should. Well, you paid him $5 million so that he could also make more money. Like, it's a little bit insane. So I think that's, not to get on a soapbox about that piece of it. I think that's a real way to do it. I think the real way to do it is figure out, what's that person worth to you? And then what are their rights possibly worth to you that you are willing to pay them more for? And you can explain it to them in a way that says, we're going to take away your burden and your obligation to go do these things on your own. It's very easy for a school to say, we're going to pay you this amount of money and look at all the opportunity you have on the outside. Well, it requires work. Are you really going to let them do that work? Just take it away from them.
You said something there that I feel like if we were ever to change the name of the show from Unilateral Decisions, we could just change it to It's a Little Bit Insane. So, Joe, what is sanity in this space? What is your unilateral decision?
Well, I mean, Mike's response there was a more eloquent version of what I was getting into.
Let's hear the tangential version then.
No, we've been on a soapbox about this. You and I feel the same way about it. But I think I'm going to go back to the crux of Dom's question and make it, about, that top student athlete. I mean, in the example, the way I'm hearing, the way you're giving it, I would hope that star player, that contract has already been, well established. And I mean, I go back to the beginning of it. Like every kid you're bringing on campus, you expect to be an all conference performer. So, I mean, in some of them, you think these are all American caliber, conference players of the year. Like, I don't know that, escalations at all conference or renegotiation windows or at all conference make sense because we expect you to be all conference. But, for somebody that goes far beyond that and brings so much to the school, I would like to think that all of those had been negotiated on the front end, and there's not an additional conversation headed into that, now fifth year. But what does that look like? And I think that's kind of going back to what we were going to get at with this, but I think it's just, we could do this for 3 episodes and still not cover everything. I'd like to believe when you bring somebody on campus and they become your star player, your head coach is going to tell you that was the expectation for that. So I would like to believe that the contract you put in front of that student athlete when you were recruiting them reflected that that's what you expected to come out of it one day. And there's going to be some give and take where you're going to offer something to the student athlete. Maybe there is a renegotiation window after 2 or 3 years. Like if you hit this, we're going to give you the ability to renegotiate with us for more money. If you don't, that's not going up. Like if you don't reach this level after 2 years or 3 years, we have the ability to terminate this contract. Those are real big boy conversations. And if you're putting those parameters around a contract when you're bringing somebody in, where you're giving the student athlete power, but you're also giving the school power, that's what contract negotiations are. So I would hope at some point we're getting to that. And if you have the ability to leave, whether a coach leaves or there's a window that you've been provided in your contract, but there are ramifications from it, I hope at some point they're enforceable, Sam. Like I hear everything you're saying, but I hope we can get to the point of sanity where this looks more consistent. We're seeing people stay longer, and the school's protected, but so is the student athlete. Like that's not a decision. That's pie in the sky wishful thinking. Probably.
Yeah, that's the ideal quality agreement, which makes sense. Sam, what's your take?
I mean, I'm having trouble saying much of anything aside from just ditto, because I think Mike and Joe just hit the nail on the head from both perspectives. I mean, you want the contract to be welcoming. You want it to be something where it allows for so much more. And Mike, I was just kind of nodding along to everything you're saying, because one thing that I've really criticized and I've written about this, about the NIL era and about, kind of the NIL, and this is pre-House settlement, but NIL in general is it essentially kind of requires athletes to a certain extent, and the House settlement certainly changed this, but it requires athletes to a certain extent to go out and essentially have a third job besides being a student and an athlete in order to get paid, where it's like, yes, they have this value from being an athlete. They have, especially for, high-level football players, they have a lot of value from being an athlete, but they can't get paid for that value. They have to go out and, seek additional stuff on their own, and collectives very quickly stepped in to fill that kind of market deficiency. And the House settlement also does a lot of that as well. But there's still so much opportunity out there. There's still so much to do out there, and without a union to negotiate group licensing deals, as we see in the professional leagues, the schools can absolutely do that as well. And I think having kind of those joint rights of having the player being able to wear a jersey on trading cards or at autograph signings or in commercials. I think there's a lot of shared value for that and a lot of ways for both sides to make a lot of money and to have a very, coexisting relationship. And, similar to your points, Joe, about kind of the institution protecting itself, I completely understand the institution needs to protect itself in a lot of these cases. I mean, we haven't even talked about morals clauses, for example, where if a player does get in trouble, if they, end up having a gambling addiction, or, and bet on their own team, or if they otherwise get in trouble, you could look at, certain programs that have, players getting DUIs every couple of, or reckless driving arrests every few days. You can have contracts that structure for that. You can have contracts that penalize athletes for that, or allow schools to terminate for that. And I think a lot of the I struggle to use the word fear mongering because I'm not sure it's that simple or that anything, but a lot of the concern around employment contracts from the player's perspective is, oh, well, you can fire the players if they're employees. Well, you can fire them if they're not employees too. You can certainly break independent contractor agreements and any other agreements like that. And I think it's reasonable to expect, it's, as Joe very eloquently put it, these are big boy contracts. These are big boy conversations that you need to have, where if you do something stupid, if you do something that really harms the reputation of the school should have the ability to reduce the value of that contract or to cut off the contract entirely. And I think that's entirely reasonable, especially given the amount of money that's at stake here. And I'm not, as much as I tend to side with the players in these conversations, I also acknowledge the reality that is a necessary part of things, and it's also an important lesson for these students to have as they enter into the real world, because it's the same kind of thing there. So having that stability, having that security on both ends, and there are ways to structure it where you're not being overly punitive in a way where, one, it may not be enforceable, and two, you're driving athletes away from your program. You can have reasonable buyouts that are very enforceable in court. You can have reasonable clauses, otherwise that are very enforceable in court. And I think it's just a matter of negotiation, because both sides are going to want something out of the deal. Those interests are often going to vary and often going to conflict with each other, but that's negotiation. And until you have a collective bargaining agreement that, has 95% of the contract pre-negotiated for you, those are the conversations that you're going to need to have.
All right. Well, that does it for this episode of Unilateral Decisions. Maybe next week we'll just let Joe go 10 minutes uninterrupted on his soapbox. I think that'd be fun for me to listen to.
I can't wait.
So we'll see if that happens or not. Either way, Sam, thank you for taking the time to join us remotely. Good luck with the rest of the conference. For everyone else, we'll see you next time.